Hey y'all, welcome back to Healthy Design. Thought we'd talk a little bit more about cell danger response today. So quick overview if you missed last week. But the cell danger response is really just the response that our body goes through after we've had some type of injury, insult, and that's kind of the healing cycle. A lot of research has been done into pathology of things, pathophysiology, how things happen, but there hasn't actually been a whole lot of research into how we heal. Um, you know, really, for a long, long time, healing just occurred so naturally that we didn't have to think about it. You would, like a broken bone, you put the cast on there, give it some time to heal, take it off, and, when the time's right and the bone's healed, and then, the bone's actually stronger at that section than it was before, and people are able to get back to normal. So we just always kind of took that for granted that that would happen. And what we're seeing with a lot of chronic diseases is that's not happening. It's not happening completely. So that's a little bit about the cell danger response. I guess too, I should kind of do the disclaimer. None of this is to be considered medical advice. I'm not a doctor. Even if I was, I'm not your doctor. So it's not medical advice for you. This is just information. Um, so just for educational purposes, give you some ideas about things, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you. So some of the things I want to talk about today are structure and function. This is really big in biology and things. You also see it like in sports too. Charlie Francis has a famous quote. I assume it came from him. Maybe it came from somebody else, but he was a sprint coach, so he would say, "If it looks right, flies right." And so that's we kind of know this. You're not going to see a sumo wrestler being really, really fast in a 100-meter sprint. Somebody like Usain Bolt, who's a whole lot lighter and different things. So, does not mean that someone doesn't, who maybe isn't quite the same shape as, you know, Usain Bolt is not going to be able to run fast. But if you don't have kind of that structure for it, you're not going to be able to run as fast as the people at the very top. So structure does determine function. From a cellular standpoint, the shape of proteins determines what they do. And so that's kind of how it is with the cells as well, and with the mitochondria. And so we talked last time how that CDR1, 2, and 3, you have different states of the mitochondria. And that CDR stage 1, you have the M1 mitochondria. In the stage 2, you have the M0 form, and then you have the M2 stage and stage 3, and that's the healthier form. When they're in that M2 state, they're anti-inflammatory, and they tend to be more filamentous in nature, and they're connected. So they're communicating with each other and everything else. When they kind of move into that M0, M1 state, at least when there's an injury that occurs, the mitochondria change their shape. So instead of being kind of this filamentous, they go to being more spherical. And so Dr. Robert Navio, he used the term like spaghetti to meatball. So, everybody knows like a spaghetti noodle is kind of long, smaller, but connected. And so in this case, when there's an injury or an insult that occurs, the mitochondria, instead of being interdependent on each other, they start to disconnect, become more round, so more like a meatball, and they aren't in that interdependent state anymore. So they are isolating themselves, becoming more autonomous. That's a signaling mechanism. And that's also a protective mechanism. It wants to try to wall off that mitochondria and then wall off that cell so that other mitochondria, other cells aren't infected or injured as well. So that's a good thing. That's a protective thing. When people are studying mitochondria with different disease processes, chronic illnesses, they'll talk about the mitochondria being dysfunctional. And that makes sense, but it's not accurate completely. The mitochondria are functioning different than a healthy, normal M2 anti-inflammatory mitochondria would, but it's supposed to be doing that. So like in that CDR stage 1, the job of the mitochondria is to be more pro-inflammatory. That helps to deal with whatever the injury was. That helps to initiate that healing cycle. So that's actually not a dysfunction there. Now, if we get stuck in that state and aren't able to complete that cycle and get back to health, then yes, that's where the issue is. But the mitochondria is still doing what it's supposed to for that stage. We just have to be able to figure out a way to get it out of that stage, get it to continue on through the cycle. So that's one of the things I wanted to bring up there. The other interesting thing, so we know the body learns, the brain learns, and it's based on previous experiences. To give an example for something outside of the body, this is how the like rain chances. It's the same kind of model. It's, so when you've had those specific weather conditions present, if it rained 50% of the time, then they're going to tell you have a 50% chance of rain. So it's based on the expected outcome of previous experience. Now, if this time it doesn't rain, then that chance for rain is going to be a little bit lower the next time. If it does rain, that chance for rain is going to go a little bit higher the next time. Our body kind of works the same way. So we are basing things off of the past experience. So your brain kind of has this expected result based on past experience. If that result happens again, it just strengthens that kind of cycle. So now that expected result's even more expected. Happens again, even more expected. Luckily, we can change that. If we are able to change that outcome so it's different than the expected outcome, now that expected outcome is a little less likely for the brain. And if we can keep doing that over time, we can change that. And so that's where plasticity comes in. We can kind of rewire things and stuff. We also see memory when it comes to the immune system. Our body responds to a foreign invader, and then it kind of keeps a memory of that so it can respond even more quickly the next time. And so there's all these places where our body remembers things. And what Dr. Navio has found is that the mitochondria will even change their geometric shape to be able to respond more quickly to things. And so we'll talk about that in just a little bit too. But it's just amazing that there's actually a true patterning and a true change in structure to help it function in the way that it needs to address those things. So I guess next, probably be a little all over the place because there's a whole lot to say, trying to keep it simple. And, I like kind of the nerdy side of it, but all of the details and nerdy information people don't need. So I try to keep that in mind. But when it comes to treating anything, we kind of have at least 3 steps, or at least 2, that we need to go through. If there is a trigger present, we want to get rid of that trigger. So again, if we have this memory of something in the past, if we keep having that same thing there, that's just going to keep strengthening that response. Now, it should be noted that I won't say never, so almost never is there only one trigger for whatever illness we're having. Normally there's multiple things that come into play. So we've got different exposures, whether it's chemicals, trauma, food, etc. All those things play a part in things too. So we have to kind of see what triggers there are, see if we can get rid of those if they're still present. A lot of times those triggers aren't still present. We just kind of have that memory. So that's kind of going back to that structure and different things too, and then just the memory of things. And so sometimes that kind of makes the cells, makes the body hypersensitive and kind of hypervigilant. So it's always looking out. So there can be that memory there that kind of is easy to trigger, even though there might not be that true trigger there. Hopefully I didn't use trigger too many times. That still makes sense. We'll see. The second thing we want to do is we want to try to make sure we provide all the nutrients that are needed. So that could be via diet, that could be via supplements, probably a combination of all those things. And so when our body is under stress, different nutrients are being burned up and they're used. That's some of the resources that are needed. And so we want to be able to provide those. And the third step, according to Dr. Robert Navio, this would be where some of the medications can come in that maybe are anti-purinergic. And so just for an example, he did a study. It was only with 10 kids, but they all had autism. Half of them got this 100-plus-year-old drug, Suramin. Always makes me think of Saruman or something with Lord of the Rings. So again, a little more nerdy stuff for you. But so I don't want to get people's hopes up. The drug did show some pretty promising results, but it's not approved by the FDA. It's only via intravenous injection. And they only did one dose, so they only did one thing, and so the benefits the kids did get were gone within 8 weeks. So it's not a one-time thing that fixes everything, but when we're talking about a chronic illness, really nothing is a one-time, shot and then everything's perfect. But they did notice that with the 5 kids who got this, that they were speaking more, eating different foods, maybe even asking for a green vegetable. And people that have children that are on autism spectrum, or different things, they know that that is not common. Picky eaters are the norm rather than kids that are wanting to branch out and eat other things. So again, they did have some pretty amazing results, but again, it's not approved by the FDA. They had to go through all these hoops to get it approved to be able to use in their study. But it was effective. And what that medication does is it helps to limit some of that extracellular ATP. And so I think what can happen with those first 2 steps, so, if we still have that trigger, then there's still an injury, there's still going to be a release in the extracellular ATP. That's part of what signals the other cells that there is danger present. And so in CDR1, that extracellular ATP is really high. It's moderate in CDR2, and then in CDR3, it goes down low, and then hopefully when we're back to normal, there's not any, or just what would be considered normal. And so it seems like having that extracellular ATP is what still signals that the danger is there. And so we have to be able to signal to our body, to the other cells, that it's safe. If it's not safe, we really don't want to signal that it is and not have that response when we need it. And so again, not having the triggers around helps to signal that it's safe. I do think as well, having some of those nutrient deficiencies managed and kind of treated and giving some of those reserves to the body, I think that also sends a safety signal instead of a danger signal, and that could help out. And so if the condition isn't too bad or kind of been going on too long, that may be enough to get the changes that we want. It may be enough to be all the change that we need. I also think it helps to explain why when we do have some chronic illnesses that, after you make those changes, I think some people do see tremendous results and they're kind of back to normal, quote unquote. And maybe that was just enough to help get them that activation to heal and finish that cycle. For other people, I think those things will help kind of get that process started, but it may not be quite enough to get that momentum, the activation going to where they can fully complete that cycle, but they do see some improvement. In those cases, I do think that's where hopefully some of the new medications that will be made to actually promote healing rather than just treating symptoms can come in. And then maybe that's enough to trigger that promotion of healing, and then they can finish that cycle. So that would be kind of ideal. Now, again, going back to the Sermon medication, he theorizes, they don't know because they weren't able to do it. But what he's hoping is that it'll be similar to kind of what I talked about earlier, the cast on a broken leg. That, you have this on there for a little bit of time, the body then heals, you take it off and move. So he's hoping that maybe those medications can be used in the same way, in the sense that they're used for a short period of time. So maybe, you do it for that one, it's a dose, and then it has a half-life, I think, of 2 weeks. So it wouldn't be like every week or something, but you could do maybe a few doses over the course of a few months, say 6 to 12 months, and then maybe they don't need that medication anymore. That's all speculation. We don't know, but maybe that's how some of this will work. This probably does bring up the point that a lot of people they're not going to be thrilled about having to use a medication. There probably are natural compounds that can do this. I'm sure there are, actually. We haven't found them all by any means, but they're also, at least the ones we know about right now, they don't work to that same extent. So, for example, kudzu root has been helpful, or been shown to kind of have a P2X7 antagonist, P27X. Anyway, you get the idea. It's one of the receptors, one of the purine receptors. And so it has been an antagonist for that, so it can limit that. And that's another receptor that's kind of been found with chronic pain, complex regional pain syndrome. And so they are looking into making drugs that might affect that and maybe help out on that chronic pain side. But again, on the chronic pain side, we know there's a whole lot of other things that have been done to kind of help change that and make a big difference. And so that's why I don't know that we're going to always need medications. I think it's going to be on a case by case basis. So we'll just have to see. And so there, with the different compounds, it seems like they might act on kind of like one specific receptor. Well, there are at least 19 purinergic receptors, and the suramin actually kind of addresses all of those, and that seems to be why it was so effective. And so what we're probably going to end up finding is that certain receptors are more involved with certain illnesses rather than others. Another thing that Dr. Navio kind of, what he thinks he's seeing based on his research is that like chronic fatigue syndrome and autism are on the same spectrum. It's just that the injury, the insult occurred at different points in life, earlier for autism and later in life for the chronic fatigue. And again, we've done all this research, finding the pathology, pathophysiology of things, and everybody's very interested in kind of what's the differences between those things. But what he's found that's more important is what commonalities do they have, especially in regard to healing. And that again seems to be some of that purinergic signaling. And so again, when the cell is threatened, when it's in danger, it releases ATP. And that becomes a signaling molecule once it's out of the cell. And some people may be thinking, oh, well, the cell just like exploded, released all of its ATP. That's not it. I mean, that can happen. I'm not trying to say that can't. But in this case, it's this coordinated release where it does go through the cell and releases that ATP. So, I mean, this is a response to things, and it's following a mechanism. So, it's not just like the cell burst open and all the ATP got released. So I think those things make a difference. One of the other things he's found with his research is kind of the context of things, and I've seen this in practice as well, that they looked at Gulf War syndrome. And if, the soldier, they looked at, they would get like a number of vaccines because they're going into, different countries, things like that. And if the soldier ended up getting, I think it was 6 to 20 of those vaccines in the war theater where stress is already there, where the CDR is already kind of primed, then their likelihood of Gulf War and illness was greatly increased. If they got the vaccines kind of here before they went over, where CDR wasn't primed, where they weren't in this huge stressful state, then their odds of that were a whole lot lower. And so, I mean, we just see this all the time, that the context plays a big role in things. And that's why sometimes too, we want to try to change that context. If we can maybe get that to be a different signal, and that can change that to where it is more of a safety signal rather than that danger signal. Another thing on that too, and again, sometimes there's triggers, we want to remove them if they're there, but sometimes they're not there and we have that memory. And so another example he shared was like with a pregnant mouse, they were able to basically kind of simulate that there was an infection. And, that infection ended up affecting the babies. And so that they would have, social disruptance. So they didn't have the same social behaviors and different things like this that would last through life. And we know in that case that trigger's not there, that illness isn't there, that, infection's not there. It's been gone for a long time, but there's still these lasting impacts. And so that's where some of this can get hard, and where we have to be careful about things too, because again, sometimes what we're dealing with is like an autoimmunity issue, or we just have to be careful, like, are we truly seeing an immune response to something that's actually there, or is it because things have just kind of been so primed, so sensitized, and that memory's still there that it's kind of getting triggered? And that can be difficult. So unfortunately, this does not give us all the answers, but it does help to give us some information. And with this, we can kind of see several different things, how they play together. We'll talk another time about chronic pain, but we see a huge thing there with, it's a danger signal to the brain, so that pain is a protective response. So pain's an output from the brain, not an input to the brain. Dr. Robert Navio even mentioned Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory, and some people will criticize it, saying there's not two vagal roots, because the way he'll kind of refer to it is there's a dorsal root for the vagus nerve, and that kind of is more what we're used to, the fight or flight, different things like that. But then there's this ventral root that actually helps us to connect with people. And so, again, maybe there's not technically two roots, blah, 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 but we do know that the vagus does play a role in that sympathetic response and the release of different chemicals and things to help us fight stuff off, be able to run faster. But it also does send anti-inflammatory messages down and things down too, and that does help to calm the system down. So again, we kind of have to complete that cycle just like we have to complete the healing cycle. So I do see a lot of overlap in these things, and I think they kind of help to explain each other. And so I think these principles, kind of having some of the knowledge of these theories can kind of help us when we're helping other people or helping ourselves. So that's a whole bunch of talking. Hopefully it wasn't too circuitous and it made sense. If it didn't, ask me some questions. You can probably tell I like talking about it. Try to give you enough of the nerdy stuff, but also want to make sure that it's practical at the same time. So hopefully I achieved that. We'll see. See you guys next time. Bye.